He spent my entire childhood trying to erase my mom and now he wants me to just forgive him? He told me he was disgusted by me. His own son. I was 17 years old, and my dad looked me in the eyes and said he was ashamed to be my father. Let that sink in for a second. Not because I did something terrible. Not because I hurt anyone. Because I refused to stop loving my grandparents. And now, 2 years later, he wants a relationship. I need you to understand something before we go any further, because this story does not start at 17. This story starts the moment my mom died, when I was 3 years old, and the man who was supposed to protect me decided that protecting his own plans mattered more than protecting me. My mom passed away when I was 3. I have no real memories of her. Just the sense of an absence, this soft and shapeless feeling that something important was missing from the center of my life, even before I had the words to describe it. My grandparents, her parents, stepped in immediately to help my dad get through one of the hardest periods any family can face. They did not wait to be asked. They showed up with food and help and presents. They babysat while he went back to work. They sat with him through the grief. They loved him the way parents do when their child marries someone and that person becomes part of the family. And after just a few months of that support, my dad made a decision that would define the next 15 years of my life. He decided that my grandparents needed to go. Not because they were harmful. Not because they were dangerous. But because he wanted to remarry, wanted me to have what he called a real mom, and he knew that if my grandparents stayed in the picture, I would grow up knowing about my biological mother. And that did not fit the family he was building. He has admitted all of this. He said it himself. He knew what he was doing and he did it anyway. There is no version of this story where he can claim confusion or ignorance or grief making him act in ways he did not intend. He made clear-eyed, deliberate decisions and then, when pressed on them years later, confirmed those decisions out loud. That is not a man who lost his way in the fog of losing a spouse. That is a man who chose a direction and walked it with both eyes open. So my grandparents fought back. They went to court and they were awarded grandparents' rights visitation, which gave them a couple of visits with me every month. My dad did not accept this. He tried to move states entirely to get out from under the court order but could not pull it off because of his job. So instead he moved us a couple of hours away and went back to court arguing the distance made the visits unreasonable. The judge compromised and gave my grandparents 2 overnight visits a month. My dad fought that too. And he lost. I want you to really sit with what this man was doing. He was not protecting his child. He was not shielding me from harm or trauma or chaos. He was running legal plays, spending time and money on attorneys and courtrooms, all to cut off the people who loved that child most. The people who had photographs of my mother on their walls. The people who said her name out loud without flinching. The people who could have given me a real and living connection to where I came from, to who she was, to the parts of her that lived on in me. And he was doing all of it not because my grandparents were bad people but because they were an obstacle to the life he wanted to design. He wanted a clean slate. He wanted a new family portrait with no one in it who reminded anyone of what came before. He met his future wife when I was 5 and introduced us when I was 6. They got serious, she moved in, and then came the moment that tells you everything about how my dad operated. He sat me down and asked me if I was excited to have a mom. There was this expectation radiating off of him, this hopefulness that I would say yes and make everything simple. I was a little kid and I told him the truth. I told him I already had a mom. That was not a radical statement. That was not a cruel one. That was a 7-year-old child, sitting across from his father, offering something real and honest and vulnerable about how he understood his own life. I already had a mom. She had just died. And do you know what my dad did with that? He took it straight to his attorney and tried to use it as evidence that my grandparents were toxic for his new family. He argued that they had poisoned me against his wife. The judge looked at the full picture and disagreed. My grandparents kept their overnights. This was the pattern. Every few months, a new legal attempt. Every few months, a new angle. He had me sit down with his attorney repeatedly, which is an incredible amount of pressure to put on a child, sitting in a formal office surrounded by adults who were carefully phrasing their questions to build a case against the people I loved. I did not fully understand what was happening, but I understood enough to feel the weight of it. I understood that my answers mattered, that something was at stake, that the adults in the room wanted me to say specific things. He pushed for adoption, not because he wanted to formalize our bond in some emotional sense, but because he had discovered that adoption could potentially be used to terminate the grandparents' visitation rights. When he looked into it more seriously, he found out a judge would speak with me directly, and apparently that was enough of a risk that he did not push it further. Okay, but can we talk about that for 1 second? He only backed off the adoption angle because he was worried about what I might say to a judge. Not because it was wrong. Not because it was hurting me. Because it was strategically risky for him. That is the kind of calculus he was running on his own child. Meanwhile, his wife was doing her own damage. While she was pregnant, she told me that I would not be allowed to know the new baby if I kept seeing my grandparents. She said this to a child. Think about that for a moment. She looked at a kid who had already lost his mother and decided the right move was to threaten him with losing his sibling too. She thought the promise of a baby, of someone to grow up with, would be enough leverage to make me trade away the grandparents I had known and relied on my entire life. When I said okay and showed no sign of crumbling or crying or begging, she completely freaked out. She had expected tears or a negotiation, not a quiet acceptance that came from a child who had already learned how to hold on to what mattered and let the ultimatums wash over him. And my dad, naturally, tried to find a way to use even that moment in court. There was also this recurring guilt trip about the overnights. My dad used to tell me that it was not fair my grandparents would take me for visits but not invite my half-siblings or his wife's niece who had moved in and become a kind of stepsister to me. He framed my grandparents as selfish for having a relationship specifically with me, their biological grandchild, the child of their daughter who had died. As if they were obligated to absorb his entire new family into their grief or forfeit their relationship with me. As if the very specific love between a grandparent and a grandchild, the kind that forms in the wreckage of loss, needed to be democratized and distributed equally before it could be considered legitimate. The audacity of that argument is something I still cannot fully process. And then there were the games with scheduling. Once I was old enough to have a phone and communicate with my grandparents directly, my dad used to get visibly angry about it. His jaw would tighten. The air in the room would shift. He would deliberately plan family days, movies, outings, dinners that felt designed to compete, on the same days I was supposed to have my overnights with my grandparents. And then he would frame my choice to keep my existing plans as proof that I prioritized them over my real family. He said that part of growing up was learning to put your nuclear family first. He said that extended family should come second. But the reason I did not consider his wife and kids my nuclear family in the first place was because of the environment he and his wife had created over years and years of making me feel like a problem to manage rather than a child to love. He built walls and then blamed my grandparents for the distance. When I was 17, he gave me an ultimatum. His voice was flat and certain, like a door closing. He said he was tired of my grandparents ruining his family and that I had a choice to make. He said it like there was still a real choice available, like both options were reasonable. I told him I would never cut my grandparents off. And that is when he said it. He told me he was disgusted by me. He said he was ashamed to be my father. He said he was done with me when I turned 18. And then, because he could not stand the idea of my grandparents feeling like they had won even a single moment, he made sure I understood that I was not going anywhere before my 18th birthday. He kept me there. Not out of love. Out of pure spite and stubbornness. The next several months in that house were a specific kind of quiet that felt more like a sentence than a family. I moved out the morning of my 18th birthday. Not the afternoon. Not after a final conversation or a last shared meal or any kind of goodbye that resembled closure. The morning. He had spent years telling me he was done with me the moment I turned 18, and so I took him at his word, because that was the one thing in this whole story I believed he meant completely. They did not speak for 2 years. Now he has reached out. He says he misses his son. He says he never thought 2 years of silence would go by. And I want to pause on that framing for a second, because the idea that 2 years surprised him suggests he thought the silence would break on its own, that time alone would do the work, that his son would eventually soften and come back without anything needing to change. And here is where I want to slow down further, because this part deserves real attention, not just a quick reaction. His message did not come with an apology for what he said at 17. It did not come with an acknowledgement that spending an entire decade dragging his child through court hearings to erase a connection to a dead mother was wrong. It did not come with any sign that he understood why the silence happened or what his role in it was. It came with the framing that he still does not like the situation, meaning my grandparents, meaning nothing has changed, but that I am still his son. As if that is supposed to be the bridge. As if biological connection alone is supposed to undo everything that was deliberately and methodically built between them over a decade and a half. As if love is a fact that operates independently of behavior. And yet this young man says he still loves his dad. He is conflicted. He carries both things at once, the grief over what his father did and the grief over the father he never really had, and those two griefs push against each other in ways that are exhausting and disorienting. And I think that is the most human and honest and heartbreaking part of this whole story, because loving someone who has hurt you is not weakness. It is not confusion. It is not a sign that the damage was not real. It is just love. It does not come with an off switch even when it probably should. Here is where I land on this, and I am going to be direct about it. The central problem has not been resolved. His dad still views the grandparents as the enemy. He said as much in the very message where he asked for reconciliation. Which means if this young man re-enters a relationship with his father, he is re-entering a dynamic where his bond with his grandparents will always be a source of conflict, manipulation, and pressure. That has not changed. It will not change unless his father does the actual internal work to understand why what he did was wrong. And there is zero evidence of that in anything that has happened so far. A relationship should not require you to carry the full emotional cost of someone else's choices. His dad made choices. Years and years of deliberate, legally documented, emotionally damaging choices that left real marks. And now the invitation to reconnect arrives without accountability, without apology, and with the same underlying resentment still sitting right below the surface. That is not reconciliation. That is the same dynamic with softer packaging. What this young man went through was a specific kind of harm that does not get talked about enough, and it deserves to be named clearly. His father tried to rewrite his identity. He tried to erase a mother, replace a family, and punish a child for having emotional loyalty that did not fit the blueprint. The fact that this young man held on to his grandparents, held on to the memory of his mom, held on to his own truth through all of that says everything about who he is. His therapist is right that this decision belongs to him alone. But if he does choose to open that door again, he deserves to walk through it with his eyes completely open and without giving up a single thing that kept him whole when his dad was trying to take it all away. My boyfriend of 1.5 years just revealed a deal breaker he never mentioned, and now I feel like I never knew him. She has lived with this boy for months in a 20 by 30 foot room, surrounded by a fish tank, a turtle, a hamster, and 3 mice, quietly drowning in dishes and laundry that are never hers, and when she finally said she needed space to breathe, he told her that moving out without him would be a deal breaker. After 1.5 years together. After knowing each other since elementary school. That word. Deal breaker. Sit with it. When you hear the word deal breaker, you usually imagine it being used to describe something serious being revealed. A secret family. A hidden addiction. A belief system that cannot coexist with yours. It is a heavy word. It signals that a boundary has been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. So it is genuinely jarring to hear it used here, deployed not to protect someone from real harm, but to prevent a 19-year-old woman from having the option to live in a space where she is not miserable. She had been asking him about moving out since January. Not out of nowhere, not after one bad night, but after months of waking up in a room that felt like it was slowly compressing around her. A fish tank humming in the corner, a turtle making its small sounds, a hamster spinning on a wheel at 2 in the morning, 3 mice rustling in their cage, and her, lying there, mentally cataloging whose dishes were in the sink again and whether she had the energy to deal with it or whether she would just silently handle it the way she always silently handled it. She brought the conversation up carefully, the way you do when you love someone and you do not want to wound them, but you are also starting to understand that staying quiet is wounding you. She framed it constructively. She pointed out that renting would let them both learn how they function independently, that it would give them a real picture of their dynamic before locking into anything permanent. His answer was that renting is basically throwing money away. And look, that is a financial opinion that exists. Some people genuinely believe it. But when your girlfriend is telling you she is overwhelmed, that she is struggling, that the current living situation is making her miserable, the response cannot just be a dismissal based on a personal philosophy about real estate. She was not asking him to debate investment strategy. She was telling him she was drowning. The conversation deserved more than that, and he did not give it to her. Now here is what actually concerns me about this whole situation, and it goes deeper than the dishes and the laundry and the shared room. The pattern she is describing, where she brings up an issue and it does not get resolved, where she expresses a need and it gets sidestepped or minimized, where she finally pushes hard enough to name an alternative and suddenly an ultimatum appears. That pattern is worth paying close attention to. Because individually, any one of those things could be written off as immaturity or a bad week or a communication gap. But together, across more than a year of relationship and several months of shared living, they paint a picture of someone who is not engaging with her needs as real and valid things that deserve real and valid responses. She has probably talked herself out of her own frustration more times than she can count. She has probably told herself he means well, he is trying, this is just an adjustment period. And maybe some of that was true. But there comes a point where a pattern is not an accident anymore. It is just how things are. The ultimatum itself deserves its own examination. He did not say he would be hurt if she moved out without him. He did not say he would feel disconnected from her or worried about the relationship. He said it would be a deal breaker. That is a threat. It is dressed up in relationship language, but functionally it is a threat. It says, make the choice I want or lose me entirely. And the thing about threats in a relationship is that they do not come from nowhere. They come from someone who has decided that controlling an outcome matters more than understanding why the other person needs something different. Think about what it takes to hear someone you love say, I am not doing well and I need a change, and to respond not with curiosity or compromise, but with a consequence. That is a choice. He made it. I want to be fair here because she clearly loves him and she has known him for most of her life. The list of genuine positives she gave is real and it matters. He is thoughtful in the ways people can see. He remembers small things, he supports her when she changes her look, he helped get her car running, he shows up when she needs comfort. Those are not nothing. Those are real acts of love. But love is not just what someone does when things are easy. Love is also what someone does when you come to them with a problem and say I am struggling and I need something to change. And on that measure, based on everything she has described, this relationship has a serious gap. Oh, and by the way, not communicating well after 2 minutes is doing a lot of heavy lifting as a downside when the main issue is that he cannot seem to hold a serious conversation about where they are going to live and whether she is actually okay. The friends and family in her life are flagging this as controlling behavior, and I think they are reading something real. Controlling behavior in relationships does not always look dramatic. It does not always look like someone yelling or issuing demands in an obvious way. Sometimes it looks like a partner who consistently redirects important conversations, who dismisses needs as impractical, who never quite makes space for compromise, and who then, when the other person has reached their limit, pulls out a consequence designed to make leaving feel impossible. And here is the insidious thing about that kind of control. It makes you feel like you are the unreasonable one. Because he is not yelling. He is not threatening her in a way that looks obviously alarming to the outside world. He is just quietly making it clear that her choices are only acceptable if they align with what he wants. That is a quieter form of control, but it is control nonetheless. Here is what I genuinely believe. She is not asking whether she is allowed to love him. She clearly does. She is asking whether this version of the relationship, the one where she is responsible for the emotional labor, the physical upkeep, and apparently also for not exercising any independent choices about her own living situation, is the version she can keep choosing. She is 19 years old and she is already exhausted. She is already navigating a dynamic that asks her to shrink her needs down to a size that is manageable for someone else. And the honest answer to that question is no. Not because he is a monster, but because a relationship where one person is consistently managing the other and then being warned off any move that might shift the balance is not a partnership. It is an arrangement that only works when one person keeps shrinking. She mentioned that moving out might help her understand whether he would step up in a shared space if she were not there absorbing all the slack. And I think she already knows the answer to that. Not because she has proof, but because she has been watching him for a year and a half and she has seen what he does when the pressure is on him versus when it is quietly on her. She knows how the dishes accumulate. She knows whose laundry gets done first. She knows who brings things up and who waits to be pushed. She has all the data. The fact that she is asking the question is the answer. My take is this. The deal breaker he named is not actually about her leaving the house. It is about her doing something on her own terms, outside of his approval, that changes the shape of their relationship in a way he did not agree to. And that is the thing she needs to think very carefully about before she makes any decision. Because someone who turns your need for personal space into a threat at 19, when you have your whole life ahead of you and no legal or financial ties binding you together, does not get easier to live with as the years go on. They get harder. The stakes get higher and the threats get heavier and the space you have to move in gets smaller. She deserves someone who, when she says she is miserable, says, then let us fix it. Not someone who says, fix it my way or lose me. That is not love with conditions. That is just conditions. Drop a comment below telling me which story hit harder. I genuinely want to know. If you made it this far, a like and subscribe would mean everything.